Welcome to EconomicZ101, the podcast made for Gen Z by Gen Z, bridging the gap between economics, finance, current events, and our generation, with speakers Vish, Wretam, Sinan, and myself, Mihir. Today, we're going to be talking about the crisis in Afghanistan and the Taliban situation. Over the past week, things in the Middle East have escalated so much. This past Sunday, the Kabul airport got taken over by the Taliban, and things have gotten so much higher since President Joe Biden and the U.S. announced that they would withdraw from Afghanistan. Obviously, tensions are really high in the Middle East, and people are scared, as are the Afghanistani citizens and refugees. Today, we're going to be going over the context of how the Taliban came together, what was the beginning of the conflict in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and what is the U.S.'s response, and what has Joe Biden put out so far. We're going to begin with history.
Yeah, so there is a lot of context behind this, actually. So although this topic has been brought up just recently, it's been an ongoing thing since like the 1970s and 80s. So back when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were in a Cold War, right? Soviets, they actually invaded Afghanistan in like the 1980s to impose a communist government, right? So, but when big power nations like the U.S. confronted them, they're like, oh shoot, and they were driven out. However, with many years of Soviet control over the government, right? Despite them being driven out, Afghanistan, it just fell into a bunch of chaos. Like civil war broke out against the new governments, and there was just different groups and leaders coming out, and it was just crazy.
One of these groups actually was fighting against the government with the Mujahideen. This was a guerrilla-esque warfare group that was created to fight against governments from the Soviet Union. And essentially, with the US's policy of containment and protecting against the spread of communism, the US government armed and funded this group to fight against the Soviet Union. Eventually, this group broke into factions, and one of these groups was the Taliban. Of course, the group that's taking power now. And another person that came to power was the infamous Osama bin Laden, which founded Al-Qaeda. The Taliban and these factions ensured and enforced brutality throughout the state and continued their reign for years on.
Yeah, so as we've seen, the Mujahideen split into multiple factions, and we're going to focus more on the Taliban, like since we're more focused on that today. So they were like extremist Islamics. They followed the Quran by script. They took things very seriously and like word for word. So just for example, they curtailed the role of women severely, right? They did not allow them to go to school or get jobs. Just a few days ago, after the Taliban, they took over Afghanistan, they literally walked into a bank and kicked out all the women workers. Like it's just like unfathomable how crazy their standards are, right? Any woman like seen without any face covering was punished. It was so bad that like even with women walking around, it still wasn't enough. So they obviously wanted religious control over Afghanistan as well, right? As they wanted to impose Islam throughout the nation. So they went through measures such as taking down like Buddha statues, knocking down other like churches, monasteries, etc. But keep in mind, this was all in the south of Afghanistan. The north was kind of like a bastion of resistance who still wasn't taken over yet.
That's also part of the reason why so many people were like scared to stay in Afghanistan after the Taliban took control. I'm sure you guys saw the videos with like people jumping out of planes and things like that. Like that's how bad it was when they took control before.
Yeah, it's just insane, man. But then, so while this was going on, this continued for like another like 10, 20 years. And then finally in 2001, many of us know the 9/11 attack where Al-Qaeda, like, they took out the Twin Towers in New York. And so upon retreating, Afghanistan was the safe haven for Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden to stay in. So when US President George W. Bush requested like to hand them over, essentially, Afghanistan was like, nope, because it was a sanction for terrorist groups all throughout. And because of this, the US, they struck Afghanistan, right? They took out the Taliban, their government, they brought their power down back to zero.
With that power struggle, soon the Taliban fled to Afghanistan to Pakistan. And while they're taken in with the help of Pakistan's military assistance, the Taliban was reborn as a guerrilla agency, and they slowly grew influence more and more over the next 2 decades. And because of that, they wanted to have the U.S. withdraw from the military. And from there, they spent growing slowly and slowly for over the past 20 years. And it happened. Currently, we see now that the U.S. has split apart from Afghanistan.
Right. So after 20 years of the U.S. dumping, as President Biden said recently, $2 trillion into military expenses, from helping them out in war efforts to training their military itself, right? What we could say that like the U.S. well prepared them for war and in any chance that the Taliban rose back. However, even despite these things, after a 20-year wait of the Taliban's waiting for the U.S. to leave and the U.S. sitting there like ducks waiting for something to happen, it was time that they drove out. And then the past week was the outcome of that.
And this outcome is coming to an unfruitful situation now. As we said at the beginning, the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, is coming to an absolute destructive end. As U.S. troops are leaving, they attacked villages and places whose people did not put up a fight at all. And that was a major part of the contention that other Western countries had with the Afghanistani military, not putting up a fight against the militants. Now you see, as Vish mentioned earlier, the infamous videos of tons of people ended up committing suicide in fear of the tyranny that the Taliban will put up for the next few weeks. And this is all a consequence of what happened on 9/11, as Sinan said earlier. This sense of militant action in the Middle East, chaos, Western countries intervening in places usually leads to bad things happening. The Civil War, the Soviet occupation, Afghanistan was in shambles. While the US and NATO eventually worked together to replenish many parts of Afghanistan with schools, social reform, hospitals, etc., one positive was that women workers were allowed to attend school and things were better-esque from a social standpoint. But obviously, good things come to an end, where militant action started to rise, war increased. Obama deployed 100,000 troops in Afghanistan and eliminated Osama bin Laden in 2011. But the Taliban continued to grow.
Right. So Obama actually did this as a way to show that there's even 10 years after deploying U.S. troops into Afghanistan, they're not backing down, right? They want to support Afghanistan with their full force in like 2010, right? And even though the quality of life for many people were improving in Afghanistan around the 2010, unfortunately, as Mihir said, the power of the Taliban still continued to grow as they sought refuge in Pakistan and continued to grow from there, right? President Obama, then after waiting for a couple more years, he decided that he would declare to withdraw from war in 2014, right? It's been almost 15 years. Not much has happened for the progression of peace. And so from then on, they withdrew from war efforts, right? The U.S. put more money and time into training the military instead, rather than assisting them in war directly, right? And basically, President Trump, when he took over in 2016, initially he said that, he was going to abide with what President Obama was going to do and just keep them out of war efforts. But unfortunately, he did not stick to that, and they continued to pursue war efforts early in his campaign and all throughout like 2018.
Then in 2020, he managed to strike a deal with the Taliban, which they eventually stopped attacking U.S. forces and have the U.S. withdraw entirely from May 2021, which was 3 months ago now. Now the current situation with Biden is a bit different, as the withdrawing point is early September, I believe. And the Taliban has now pledged to cut ties with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Afghanistan. Backing up and reducing violence was the point for this deal. And obviously, the war effort has been extensive and brutal. Thousands of people have died, trillions of dollars spent, and not that much social leeway made. These pledges were not properly enforced by the U.S., and the result of it is what's happening in Afghanistan right now. And now we're into the current situation. Things are going badly very, very fast. We have factions in the US saying we should have stayed there, we should have left. But the outforce and the violence that the Taliban is putting forward has not stopped at all.
So the violence itself has increased significantly. As we saw before, we saw the planes where all these refugees are standing over and then trying to get inside with no avail. And overall, you see these Taliban protests taking over several cities, in which these commercial cities in Afghanistan are being taken over by both these Taliban forces. Overall, you see all these people from the Taliban seizing control at like Kabul airport, and that's where it was U.S. owned officially. So once they left, the Taliban was it was free real estate at that point.
Yeah, and the Taliban started to give out details to the public on how they were going to run their government, which angered people even more. And the efforts that the Taliban was making to take over Afghanistan was also hurting the economy heavily because people weren't leaving their homes because they were so scared, right? And then people started to buy less, like even though there's online options, people were just buying less and saving up money so that in case anything were to happen and really hurt small businesses.
And that eventually leads to how US troops are actually getting evacuated. The American government is making sure that their troops are getting out safely. And with that comes negotiations, letting the troops out, letting innocent Afghanistani citizens leave. But despite the negotiations, there are still people being beat and hurt at these airports, which is the proper cause to the situation in Kabul right now. So far, over 5,000 people have left the country, but there's tons of journalists and neutral citizens in Afghanistan who are still stuck there. The situation isn't really getting better, and maybe in part is consequence to other Western nations not taking a part. The US is leaving, but the situation with Britain is even more interesting.
Yeah, with some of the statements that Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain has been making, he was saying things about how he wants to allow less refugees to come in, which he was met with a lot of criticism because he was only allowing 5,000 people into Britain. And he was saying that he was going to give priority to women and children who would be more subjected to violence with the Taliban in control. And even his predecessor, Theresa May, was condemning him for not trying to make some efforts with like NATO nations and like trying to work out a way to take over, like defeat the Taliban and like prevent them from getting into power. But Boris Johnson also came back saying that without the help of NATO countries and US troops, there would be no point, and it would be basically impossible to prevent the collapse of the Afghanistan government.
And that's case in point with how dangerous politics are in this situation. Obviously, we look in the news, we read articles thinking, hey, another political stuff is going on in part of the world. But humanitarian crises are so often, and the ignorance toward it is so apparent. Now what's happening is because of propaganda and dangers of terrorism, parts of government in European countries, like what's happening with France saying they cannot take refugees, are consequence of other terrorist actions that have happened. If there was a bombing in the country, if there was a recent issue with terrorism, that type of Islamophobic rhetoric is being pushed towards all Middle Eastern countries, and the situation with Afghanistan. These innocent people have nowhere to go, and is the consequence of terrorist groups and the lack of help from other nations. And it's frankly sad to see, but it's totally disgusting in a way that these top leaders from the Taliban are able to get that much power, that much money, that much influence, and still win over with the power of tons of Western nations against them.
Something we often forget is the fact that the Taliban was something that the US essentially created. So all these problems that happened, the Taliban was the direct cause of it. So the fact that these are our issues the US has caused is causing problems for both the refugees and these people of Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the people leading the Taliban aren't exactly like Haibatullah Akhundzada, and his son, he was a huge proponent of suicide bombing, and he's the main leader of the Taliban. And he was such a proponent of suicide bombings that he let his son die at 23 as a suicide bomber. And his deputy, Sirajuddin Haqqani, he was also he's part of creating the network for the Taliban. And the US has been trying to hunt him down for a long time, since like the incident between 1995 and 2001, where the Taliban was in power then. He's been on US list for that long. And he has been part of many hostage attacks and assassinations that have happened in several different countries in the West and Europe. And he also has many ties to Al-Qaeda, and the Haqqanis are said to be the connection between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And now with the Taliban like taking control of most of the big commercial cities in Afghanistan, they're starting to go to the capital, and they're starting to take control of the 40 million people who live in Afghanistan. And again, it's angering the public.
Not only public, this is massive red flags for public safety. And with public safety comes social safety. As we said a little bit earlier, the US and Western countries made a little bit of progress with the way that women were allowed to go to school, allowed to work, and LGBTQ rights in Afghanistan. But with the Taliban coming back into power, there are definitely mixed signals.
Yeah, as Mihir was saying, like as before the US drove out the Taliban from Afghanistan, right? They had extremely misogynistic values and ideals pushed onto women where they weren't allowed to work, go to school, etc., right? So, and this all took place like between like 1996 and 2001, right? However, with the new Taliban, they're saying that like they want to be more progressive and find things for women that would be much more different than before. So they want to improve the life quality of life for these women, as they're claiming right now, but who knows how far that truth's going to go towards. Some women in universities are not even allowed to leave without a male guardian. Some women's universities and women's health clinics are also being shut down and blocked by the Taliban. And it has people worried that the claims that the Taliban made may be a facade. And the Taliban, they're known for like obviously not keeping promises. When Trump struck their deal in 2020 that they would stop attacking and put an end to their terroristic activities if the US drove out from Afghanistan, they literally attacked Afghanistan again, like right before the US like could even completely evacuate the country, right? So they're not really that truthful in their word.
I mean, I remember seeing this CNN interview where this one woman, I completely forgot her name, when she's one of the CNN news reporters. She was interviewing a few men in Afghanistan, and they were talking about, they were mentioning about how like women, they can continue to be educated, yet all of these rules and everything we implemented later on. And you can see that during the interview as well. For one thing, you can tell by the beauty parlors that were in Afghanistan, they were being burned down, they were being shut down. And even during the interview itself, one of the woman reporter was asked to step aside. She wasn't able to conduct an interview anymore. And that just seemed pathetic.
It's genuinely crazy, right? Because we're so lucky to be in a place where we don't have to deal with the civil wars, constant militant activity, and the stuff that we're hearing about on the news, especially what you said, Wretam, it's really disheartening. The current situation has gotten to a really negative start, but what precedes that, and possibly what's more important, especially for our country, is the United States response to the situation and what President Joe Biden has been saying. His major policy for the Afghan war has been relatively interesting, but he hopes to stand squarely behind his decisions.
I mean, despite all the backlash he's been given, Biden believes in the decision. He believes that what he did was right and essentially is the best decision of all. He himself quotes during the press conference, "I'm now the fourth American president to preside over war in Afghanistan. 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, the likes of Trump, Obama, and Bush. I will not pass this responsibility onto a 5th president." So he himself acknowledges the fact that I'm sorry, let me move on. He himself acknowledges the fact that Afghanistan itself is a huge issue, despite any outcome that came out of that. So Biden just wants to be the president that ends it.
I mean, he of course said that, like, that America gave them every tool they could need, right? They paid their salaries, they provided for maintenance of their airplanes, right? With the U.S. military providing incentive to the people in Afghanistan, like Biden believes that the decisions he has done are justified. He also said that we gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. It's crazy, man. I know I said before, $2 trillion thrown into helping fund Afghanistan, their military, and just recouping. Yet they couldn't give something that can't even be like measured in money.
Yeah, and even though the US gave Afghanistan $2 trillion to help them like protect themselves, they didn't put up a fight at all when the Taliban started to try and take over the country. And even the leader of Afghanistan left the country before the Taliban was doing all these things and using violence to take control of protests. He was already gone. And with all this, people are saying, like, countries are saying how they're planning to support Afghanistan refugees. And countries in Europe and the US are trying to see what they can do to bring in refugees, which is kind of selfish considering that there's 40 million people who need help and need to get to somewhere safe with all that's going on, but countries are only allowing like a few thousand to come into their country. So it's really not fair at all to these refugees.
It's like dangerous in a way, because you want to think, right, as big Western countries with strong economies, you want to help people who are in need. And this isn't a political situation. This is a humanitarian crisis. And helping refugees escape from the dangerous areas that they're in is something that P5 countries, at the very least, should be empowered to do. And Biden's plan doesn't really include that. In fact, even though he doesn't want to look at the refugee situation, he vowed to rescue many innocent Afghan lives. And with that comes tons of journalists in the area which are stuck there reporting the news. It's actually crazy because you want to think about it from a larger perspective, right? As a leader of the quote, quote, most powerful nation on earth, having stronger initiative to move forward and help out in these dangerous situations should be the number one aspect. But with so much bipartisan support in the media and criticism throwing around, there's a lot of stuff happening, and hopefully the right decisions are made and Biden follows through with leaving the war. This has been very expensive, very brutal, and very hard for both Afghan and American people across the world. And that leads into what can we do? Obviously, sitting at home, we're seniors in high school now. A lot of college students listening to us, people from Gen Z. What can we do to help out that isn't completely performative and will actually do something?
I mean, yeah, other than awareness and other performative campaigns and so on, one big crucial way we can do is just donate. Donate $5, donate $10, any amount of money you're willing to spend. And one key donation place that I did while learning about this was the rescue.org. It helps families in Afghanistan and even worldwide as well. But currently the situation, they're going to be focusing mostly on Afghanistan. We'll provide the link in the description for the video itself. But yeah, they talk exactly about how every this specific amount of money you're able to feed or help provide tents. One example is if you donate $54, you provide 4 tents. You donate $73, you can feed 83 children. But they allow any bit of money, and I believe it's a great way to help the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you for that, Wretam. Obviously, we can do what we can in our tried times. We can send our prayers out that the situation will improve. But oftentimes with geopolitical issues, as we did in our last podcast with the Iraq War, the major thing that we should pull away from this, obviously with the help that we can do on our own end, it's the context and the historical situation that have preceded it. America, Western countries intervening in demilitarized, destabilized nations create problems. And whether this happened for a spite to stop communism in the 1970s has trickled into hundreds of thousands of lives lost over the course of 40 years. And this situation is rising even to now. We hope you keep aware stay updated and understand the situation as it grows further. Today we covered our second addendum to our first topic on the Iraq War, now the crisis in Afghanistan. This situation will update, and maybe if there's something major that happens, we'll put another podcast on it. But once again, as always, thank you very much for listening to the podcast. Thank you so much. Please check out all our socials in the description below. Check out our TikTok. We're posting good stuff on there. And it's been good. Goodbye.
MK, like.
Bye.